Welcome to Psychology Matters. I'm Sarah Carper, your host. We're welcoming today Dr. Brent Davis from the Davis Holistic Chiropractic Center, and Dr. Davis is also the co-founder of Heaven Sent Hemp. Welcome, Dr. Davis. We're
Thanks.
glad to have you here.
Good to be here.
You've been practicing holistic medicine and preventative medicine for over 40 years. That's impressive.
This is my 41st year, yes.
That's wonderful. Tell us more about alternative medicine and about your practice.
That's a long story, and I'll try and summarize it. The concepts of alternative medicine probably started gelling in the 70s, early 80s, 1970s, 80s. And you have to understand that depending on who's speaking, depends on what you know. So if somebody from Harvard or Yale University is talking about preventive medicine, they're looking at what they can do to alter mainstream medicine so that it becomes more holistic. If you talk to someone like me, who is a holistic chiropractor with a lot of background in naturopathy and homeopathy and all that, I never went through the big pharma orientation toward chemotherapy and drug therapy. Very opposite. I went through all the natural things that can be used to achieve a positive outcome treating a patient. So if I'm speaking, what I'm going to say is very different from the other end. So people make the mistake of thinking that the large medical institutions and physicians that are conventional MDs have authority, and they don't, because they haven't been practicing this stuff. So I don't write prescription drugs. So if I get somebody that's very sick well, I have to do it in a different way. So what we learn is, over the years, you learn great respect for all areas of health intervention because they're needed at different times. So what I focus on is looking at someone, determining if they're in late-stage illness or relatively healthy. That's the first thing. And how you treat them and manage them depends very much where they are. If they are coming in for wellness care, it actually is much more refined. When someone's really late-stage illness, it's tough. It's tougher because so many preventive things were never done for them.
Right. So now you're doing pain management.
Yeah, you're doing late-stage management, which you've already kind of lost part of the battle. So that's where I hope what we achieve here is helping people understand what are some of the things that they can do to really get themselves healthy before the indicators of late-stage illness come in.
Right.
Yeah.
So can you tell me more about herbal medicine and your practice with herbal medicine, and particularly with industrial hemp and other CBD products?
Yeah, well, certainly I've been doing. Let's see, I started practice in 1978, and I was fascinated with herbal medicine when I was pre-med at UCLA, and it was a double major with anthropology and pre-medicine. So my family assumed that I would be a physician, a regular medical physician, and I did. I helped as an assistant orderly in the emergency room at UCLA Med Center, and I worked for the head of the pathology as an assistant. And I just realized that it wasn't going to be for me. That just wasn't the thing that I thought would be the best professional choice for me. And because when I was doing the pre-med studies, I was sitting there in the History of Medicine library at UCLA, which is a wonderful library. And I was always looking at the traditions of healing from the past. So I had a great respect for herbal medicine, and I started experimenting in my practice right when I began in 1978. So I would obtain the highest quality herbal medicines, which at that time came from Europe, Switzerland, Germany, primarily Germany, and some of those very fine quality herbal medicines which were not being manufactured in the United States. I started studying how they were doing it there, and I decided, like a crazy person that I am sometimes, I'm just going to start an herbal company, which I did in 1981. And so I started making one thing, the greatest medicine at the time that I knew about, which was echinacea.
Oh, sure.
And I made that about 4 years before it started getting really a lot of market coverage. Maybe about 1985, people started really hearing about echinacea. But I spent years developing that product, and very interestingly, as it turns out, all these years later, people realize that echinacea has a cannabinoid in it, a cannabinoid-like substance.
Well, that's interesting.
And that's one of the reasons why it acts so profoundly. And echinacea is a profoundly acting herb.
So before we go into further detail, tell us a little bit more about echinacea and what the properties
Well,
of echinacea are
it's
good
not
for.
being used correctly, for one thing, because the greatest benefit of echinacea is to take toxic material out of the bloodstream and stimulate the immune system. Once you've done that, if people keep taking echinacea all the time, it never acts as strongly as it did initially.
Interesting.
So it's fine. It's a great remedy. But once I've interestingly enough, it has the ability sometimes to reverse some of the negative effects of vaccination. Very interesting. So it's one of the substances that should be looked at if there's problems for vaccination.
Fascinating.
But yeah, and then that led me to produce, more and more products over time. So that's the little company is called Forest Center Herb Farm. It's Forest Center Herbs, and it's Forest Center Herb Farm, which is 75 miles outside of Nashville. And now, just short of 4 acres on that farm is being put into industrial hemp production, and we'll talk more about that.
Right.
But it's one of the most remarkable herbs when you understand it.
Sure. And so, so you've started producing industrial hemp. So this is where we really need to try to dispel some myths and confusion, because there's industrial hemp, and we understand, there's cannabis, and then we hear the term marijuana, and everybody's so confused about what is what.
Okay.
So
All right.
can you
let me
start with some definitions and
let's-
clear up some
let's
things for us?
Go back about 20,000 years.
Okay,
and
let's
I
do.
think the historical record shows that hemp seeds are found in burial sites and stuff, certainly 10,000 years ago. It's been around for a long time, because there wasn't written record so much all that time ago. People don't really know what it was used for. It was certainly used for fiber, but it was very likely used for medicine. And then as millennia went by, it became clearer that it was being used for some of its sedative and narcotic effects, and it was being used ceremonially, and it was being used industrially. The plant in steppes of Asia, India, that region is where it originated, and it has different forms, but it really is the same plant. It's just different varieties. And the hemp plant, even to this day, it is so extraordinarily dynamic in the way it expresses itself with what's called a phenotype, the way it looks. And the chemotype is the chemistry of it, the genetics of it. One hemp variety, if you get 1,000 seeds from that variety, if you germinate all of those seeds, you can see extraordinary different levels of expression in the same variety. So it's one of the most remarkable plants. It actually is very hard to work with because of that. It has so much variability. But you have basically the form of hemp that is used, cannabis, that's thought of as marijuana, has high THC. The it's a THC is one of the cannabinoids. It's psychoactive, and then it has many other cannabinoids, of which CBD is the most well-known now.
Right.
So if it's high in THC, it's considered for medical marijuana, and for its psychotropic effects. And if it's low, less than 0.3% by weight of THC, it's classed as industrial hemp, and that's just a governmental thing.
Right.
So in 2014 was the first farm bill that enabled various states with programs to get people to join those programs as an experimental program to grow and produce that. And it's a long story. It's very political. People can go on the internet, and I really advise that they do that, because there's a lot of information out there. But it's kind of a deal between the DEA and the FDA, the Drug Enforcement Agency and the FDA, which we're used to. Their whole orientation was set up to prosecute marijuana offenders.
That's right.
And that's how it was set up. And when things run that way for decades, nobody wants to change it. But, so, things are moving so that that's really going to become an outmoded model, and they're going to stop doing that. And but I do have concern, and I've always had a concern. I wrote a paper in 1985 for a professional group called the International College of Applied Kinesiology, and that is a group of advanced care professionals who are to a large extent, chiropractors, but there's MDs, dentists, and naturopaths, and acupuncturists. There's other people that, but these are guys that really practice holistic medicine at a deep level. And a lot of colleagues had noticed that when we saw patients that were coming in that had a history of marijuana use, that they had a certain set of problems. One of the problems was the adrenal glands were being disturbed, and their energy production was not working well. They
So
had
that
problems.
lethargy that we associate with marijuana use.
Yeah, overuse.
Right,
I mean,
overuse,
people smoke
right.
a couple
Exactly,
of times. These are
overuse,
chronic
right,
users.
exactly.
And when I wrote my paper, I saw that. I actually wrote this on the basis of over 100 people that I saw in about a year's time in LA. I used to practice in Los Angeles, the Santa Monica, West LA, and Pasadena areas. And for some odd reason at that time, I saw a number of people that came in that had musculoskeletal weakness, ligamentous laxity, the weakness of the ligaments in the body. And just because I have a very broad interest in this, I happen to have spoken to an Egyptian physician who practiced outside of Cairo, and we just had it was a social conversation. He was just telling me that the way that they treated hashish problems, people couldn't walk.
Oh, wow.
As a result of overconsumption of hashish, which is a very strong form of marijuana, they used basil. So I created a product to detoxify marijuana, and I saw the most remarkable effects when these debilitated people would come in from overconsumption, getting too much THC in their body, give them basil. There are other herbs that help that, but that's actually the most effective. And when you do that, all of a sudden, some of these symptoms, their coherent ability, actually neurological tests, we can check cranial nerve function. That improves when you use basil. Anyway, so I wrote a paper in 1985 stating the problems of using marijuana, and here I am now, almost 40 years later, being an absolutely profound advocate for using the cannabis plant with high CBD, high terpenes, high phenolics, all these other compounds, and relatively low THC. So I am truly an expert on that. I am not an expert on using high THC, and we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Right. So let's sort of get into that now. So we understand the psychoactive properties and, you know, how different than that the medical marijuana is versus the CBD. So we're talking about then using the industrial hemp plant for the production of CBD. And so the use of CBD is totally different than the use of medical marijuana.
Yes.
Explain to us how that's different.
Medical marijuana is going to be from species that have been bred to have high THC, and some of it is gone crazy. There are varieties that are 30% THC.
Wow,
it's just
that's a lot.
It's way out of balance.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of physicians that are prescribing medical marijuana probably don't support that. I think that's mostly for recreational drug use, and you know, it could well be dangerous. But I just called, there's a doctor in Los Angeles, and his name is Alan Frankel, and I just actually called his office the other day because I'm really interested in the work that he's doing. He's a physician, an MD, that practiced mainstream medicine until pretty much 7 or 8 or so years ago, 10 years ago. And then he started getting more and more into using medical marijuana for managing patient care. So he's a very knowledgeable guy, and I'm going to be interested to have a dialogue with him. But he is an example of someone that is prescribed, and when you listen to some of his interviews, he's seeing that high THC is necessary. For example, they get brain development problems in autistic children and so on, the autistic spectrum disorder, cerebral palsy, and I've seen this with several cerebral palsy patients that I'm trying to help. They will have outbursts of extreme rage, and it actually becomes dangerous. They can become quite violent. So I think he's commenting that in those cases, he's using higher THC and necessary to control that. The alternative to that would be using heavy drugs, and it's very likely that the THC is better. But that's what I'm talking about. That's a very small percentage of cases. It's late-stage illness.
Sure.
And so I think we want to be very careful of thinking about, oh, well, you need to use high THC for, stage 4 brain cancer. Yeah, but how many people have it? Hopefully,
Right.
if we can
Small
act,
population.
intelligently, we won't see 1 out of 2 people
Sure.
having cancer, and the drug industry is telling us that 1 out of 2 people will soon be having cancer. Well, what can we do to change that? So if we don't go to the late stage illness, and we hopefully will maybe be able to show a little of this, or we can show the link to this, to something that I called human body collapse disorder. I wrote a little video. I created a whiteboard video that's about 9 minutes long, and it explains this extensively, puts a lot of information into a short space, what we can do with industrial hemp, the high CBD, and the other. Remember, we don't want just CBD, and we'll talk about that, why you don't want just CBD. There's a reason to use that, but again, it's a smaller percentage. But when you use the whole plant, you get what's called the entourage effect, which the various different compounds, CBD, the terpenes, phenolics, these are different flavonoids, these are different things which there are over 500 of these compounds in the cannabis plant, in hemp, that somehow, and remember, I've used a lot of herbs over 40 years, but I've never seen anything that in one plant can act more effectively than many combinations. And there are some things that, for specific immune modulation to stimulate the immune system, I'll still use single herbal substances, but to provide, here's the one key, the big thing that industrial hemp, properly prepared whole plant extracts, what they do is they take they take people out of the stress response, exaggerated sympathetic nervous system, overdrive. Get up in the morning, you drink a cup of coffee, eat a donut, and you take off, and you have just set your nervous system into a state of sympathetic overdrive. And then if you get to busy work, it just keeps getting worse as the day goes on. This exactly stops that. It's the opposite of that. So it starts supporting adrenal function, but it's not doing it by, like in our profession, we would use adrenal glandulars, various different herbal things to help the adrenals. This is going at a deeper level because it's actually changing the autonomic nervous system, of which the adrenals are a very important part. So it's so deep acting to gradually move people out of sometimes almost hysterical behavior, and when people are really stressed. If you start using proper kinds of hemp, you can just see them gradually, come down into a much more balanced state without, and intentionally avoiding sedation. So I think that's the great application for it, is people are born often with certain abnormalities in the nervous system where they tend to fire more sympathetic. Like I remember one of my teachers, he said, he was telling me about his rounds when he was doing pediatrics as a young doctor. He said, when you deliver little babies, some of them pop out with a smile, and some of them pop out screaming. And that's the way they come into the world. And that was an extremely, good image, because some little beings just come in with their nervous system set to could it be what the mother underwent? Probably, if the mother was under a lot of stress or so on.
Dispositions are just different.
They are, yeah. And so for that sympathetic dominant, it's one of the greatest things that I think that we have.
Interesting. So with the opioid crisis that we have now in treating chronic pain, do you see CBD being an alleviator for this issue, or?
Oh, absolutely. But here's the issue. We have in the company that we mentioned, which I'm a co-founder of Heaven Sent Hemp, we have an issue where we have produced something that is quite remarkable. We'll show this maybe in a little close-up, but there's a little thing at the bottom of that that is called a QR code. If you scan that, you can put that on any cell phone. The QR code will show immediately a batch analysis of that, exactly what's in it, the microbiology of it, if there's any contaminants, heavy metals, the level of CBD, the level of THC. It shows everything right away. It comes right up on the load. It's really cool. It just loads it on a web page, so everybody can see what this is.
Sure.
That meets all, it's beyond all state standards. We're one of the only companies that has that. And so you can right away see what you're getting. And it's a big problem with everybody wanting to jump into CBD production or
Absolutely.
those products. They don't all have that. So you really want to look for that. But it's an issue of, if you have someone in the workplace, well, we were talking about going back, do states, do doctors, do physicians who are prescribing the problems, the opiates, are they open to this? The answer is, yeah, an awful lot of them are, but we haven't caught up, because here's where the problem is. Like, we have people from Wisconsin calling, and the physicians want to order it, and they're saying, but we don't feel safe. Well, now that the 2018 Farm Bill passed, it's been removed as a Class 1 narcotic. It's no longer in that classification, and it is now classified as an agricultural product. So from the standpoint...
Industrial hemp.
Yes,
CBD
industrial
as
hemp, less than
industrial.
0.3%
Right.
THC, which is what everybody's growing for industrial hemp. That's throughout the United States. It's a federal law. There is no issue. There's no issue with the FDA. We'll talk about that. But where there's an issue is with medical boards. If the medical boards still haven't caught up, they can be issuing penalizing, and that's just got to go away.
Right.
Okay, so that will be, there'll be legislation introduced in Tennessee this year to get that cleared up, and I hope other states will. But the doctors see that this is definitely a possibility. And so let's get to later, we'll talk about what I've seen in my practice. It's just absolutely extraordinary how it can change pain. And again, it depends on the type of pain. There are some sorts of pain that it may not. It may not alleviate, but it should be the first thing that you try. And not only one kind of product, but you might have to try a few different varieties, okay? So we want to probably talk about the way that the CBD products are produced. And this is something that our company has paid a lot of attention to. If you want to, we can go into that. So
Yeah, let's take just a few minutes that we have left to talk about that. Tell me
Yeah.
a little bit more about
So
the production of
when
products.
you look at this, first of all, the product itself, the industrial hemp, must be a high quality that has less than 0.3% THC. Then you look at what are the properties of, what's the profile of that, which we want to have good terpenes. That's a class of compounds in there. We want to have these phenolics, the flavonoids, all of those things, and the cannabinoids, which CBD is the principal one. So to get what you see when you look at 95% of the companies that are out there now, they're using CO2, liquid CO2, supercritical CO2 extraction, which puts CO2, which is a gas, it makes it into almost a liquid state. It goes into expensive equipment, which then pressurizes it and extracts the CBD. And you can then purify that, and you can get a concentrated paste, which is then diluted, typically in some form of oil, like medium chain triglycerides, which we don't use, we don't like that. Pure coconut oil, which is okay. In our case, we use a very high quality organic olive oil.
Sure.
But it will dissolve the substances that are this sticky paste and make it into a liquid. So you can use that as a pure substance. Most physicians, and I heard Dr. Frankel say that the other day, who has a lot of expertise, they prefer the whole plant. Now, in the cases where we have random drug screening and people can lose their job, they are the people that may need to take the CBD isolate until the law changes, and it will.
Right.
Because if you refine the way that you test for urinary screening, you can get a much more refined, and you'll see if somebody's a heavy user, like a recreational drug user, or if they're just a medicinal user. And we haven't gotten to that stage yet.
Sure.
But right now, if people are getting random drug screenings, we tell them you can't use these products. You have to use a CBD isolate, which we don't recommend, except for that, that
For
particular
that
subsection.
case,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And so you have those products available?
We don't,
Oh,
not yet. We will probably look for the best form of CBD isolate. I'll have to do a lot of testing on that, and then we'll probably carry that as an addition to the product line. But right now, we specialize in this proprietary way that we've learned how to extract the plant using ancient techniques and still come out with a very high, beautiful level of CBD, but all these other things. So one of the things that I see is that when people come in as chiropractic patients, they're out of alignment, they're in pain. I've actually produced many, many videos, some of them are online, where we can neurologically see the weakness. I'm trained to test that. We can, for example, one of the things that I like to do, people can do this. You can just learn how to test the little digiti minimi muscle here and the opponent's pollicis muscle here for the thumb. If you try and do that and pull it apart, a lot of times when people have cervical problems, osteophytes, subluxations, things going on in their neck, disc degeneration, that all interferes with the nerve supply down to this area. So you can just a simple little test. You can test, a lot of times it'll be quite weak. It just doesn't strengthen. You take the transdermal that we produce, you roll it on there, and within a couple of seconds, they have 80, 90, or even 100% of strength. I've done that hundreds of times. So it's just unbelievable, and it was really unbelievable. When I started seeing that just 2 years ago, I went, oh my gosh, what is this stuff? And that's what started us on this grand journey of trying to get more and more deeply acting products. But it is a neurological, it changes the nervous system. And I think you'd asked me previously about, you know, does it act like the diazo drugs, you know, Xanax and that kind of thing? And when you asked me that question, I checked the literature, and I just saw a study done in Australia where the class of receptors in the body that alter the GABA, they're called the GABA receptors, CBD does influence those.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, very
So it should be a natural entry right away, try to get off the opioid crisis.
wonderful. Well, I hope we'll get a chance to talk more about that in another segment.
Well, I hope we do.
That's wonderful. So, Dr. Davis, this has been really interesting to hear more about your practice. I'd love to get a chance to read your book, The Floral Hand of God, Secret Healing Codes of Flowers Revealed. It sounds like a very interesting read, and sounds like your farm is really fascinating. You've got 75 acres. That must be incredible to be able to farm that.
The actual farm is 160 acres,
Oh, wow.
mostly forest, but there's just a central section where we're doing the cultivation of the herbs.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So I thank you very much for being here. This is Psychology Matters. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sarah Carpy, and this was Dr. Brent Davis.